let's take a step back to 1985. And our person of interest is a man by the name of Paul Hepler. Paul was out off the coast of New Jersey, and he was just using a magnometer to map the bottom of the ocean. What's a magnometer, you may ask? Well, it's complicated. But basically, they measure magnetic fields, so you can use them to get a rough estimate of terrain if you know how to read the data they feed back into, whatever computer you happen to be using, and etc. There's certain models that are more complicated than others, but yeah, he was doing that, and he ran into something really friggin' weird. Just two bumps. Like weird, awkward bumps. Just chilling in the middle of the ocean. Now, that isn't necessarily super weird if you assume that, say, well, maybe they're sunken ships or something like that. No. He didn't know what they were at first because the water out there is actually very dirty and murky, but on later dives, when he actually did some further investigation, he realized they're not boats. They're trains. Sitting upright, right next to each other, in the middle of the Atlantic. I mean, not in the middle, but off the coast of New Jersey, in the ocean in general. This is not normal. What are these two trains? Well, they're Planet Class 222T models. And if you've never heard of this class of locomotive, I don't really blame you. They weren't produced very long, because by the time they were made, they were actually already obsolete. So not many were made and not many people bought them. Now, in their defense though, these Planet Class, these little itty-bitty engines were actually extremely strong in terms of their actual power output, their tractive effort for their size. Like, they weren't bad based off of what they were. It's just by the time that they were made, there were already larger, more efficient engines that could pull a great deal more, even though, again, for their size, the Planet Classes weren't, they weren't bad trains at all. But I guess the question is, how exactly did two of these trains get out off the coast of New Jersey under 90 feet of ocean? And the answer to that is actually a total frickin' mystery. No, seriously, I wish I had a real story to tell you here, but investigation has taken place into the origin of these two trains, and while we know what they are, we don't know where they came from, who dropped them here, who purchased them, who manufactured them. I mean, we know who manufactured this model of locomotive, so we assume that company had to have done it, but there's no record of these particular trains, these specific ones, being built, or being lost, or being purchased. There's nothing! They're just here! The running theory is that these were being shipped down the coast from Boston, and at some point a storm occurred, and whether or not the crew threw them overboard on purpose to save their ship, or they were simply lost in the waves by accident, either way, that's what people seem to think probably happened when it came to how these trains got put where they are. That's the best theory, but it could be a lot of things. They could have been intentionally dumped just to get rid of them, but that seems weird, because why wouldn't you scrap them if that's what you were doing? Maybe they flew. Maybe they were thrown on a giant catapult. Look, any theory makes sense at this point. They're just there, sitting upright on the ocean floor. And maybe a few of you are probably noticing this keeps happening, where it seems like a lot of these underwater trains are actually sitting upright. And I can actually very easily explain why that keeps happening. See, it generally doesn't matter how the train got thrown into the water. As long as it's intact, it probably will wind up sitting on its wheels if it's a well-built train. Why? Well, think about it. Most vehicles, one of the things manufacturers like to avoid is making them top-heavy. This goes for trains too, not just cars or anything really, because if something's top-heavy, it's more likely to tip over on curves. So trains often had most of their weight lower towards where their wheels sit, so they weren't as likely to tilt. It's just a sensible thing to do. Therefore, when you're sinking, the heavier part of a train would tend to fall downward at a faster rate than the lighter element, resulting in the train really wanting to sit upright. It doesn't necessarily guarantee it, but that's likely why it seems like a lot of these trains wind up sitting on their wheels, because that's what they're built to want to do from a physics perspective. In any event, No one knows where these trains came from, no one knows why they're there, but they are very interesting. To the point that a gentleman by the name of Dan Leib is trying to work with the New Jersey Museum of Transportation to actually bring these two trains up to the surface. There's actually a plan in motion to bring them up. For the first time in this whole... since I've started talking about underwater trains, I actually can tell you that they do want to bring these two to the surface. There are two main reasons for this. A, there are zero, zilch, not a single example of these engines in the world left. They were all destroyed, scrapped. So the only two remaining are sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So from a preservation perspective and a historical perspective, there is a tremendous draw to try to get these things to the surface so they can be displayed for the public to view them. Now, the other thing that makes them a bit more likely to be brought up is that while they are in the ocean, which you'd think would be a little harder to deal with than, say, a lake, these trains are not nearly as deep as the last two trains we talked about that were underwater. They're only under 90 feet of water. And I know that sounds like a great deal, and it's not exactly a small amount, but compare that to 694, which is underneath 235 feet of water in Lake Superior, or God help you 3512, which is nearly 600 feet down in Slocan Lake. So, despite being in the ocean, the two T models are actually technically more accessible in terms of getting them to the surface. Also, despite being in the ocean and therefore being exposed to salt water, they're not in that bad a shape, all things considered. You can still tell they're trains, and they seem to be relatively intact. So the notion of bringing them up and actually being able to restore them is something that is definitely in the cards for these two. Now the real question is, alright, well if they bring them up, are they gonna run again? And I've been getting a lot of comments about this factor that I keep saying lately, because I tend to be a little more lean on the, the skeptical side when it comes to getting these trains to run. A lot of people have pointed out that there are other trains that have been brought up from similar cases, whether it be under the ground or underwater or whatever, and have been restored. And I'm not saying it's necessarily impossible for these kind of trains to be restored into a running state, but I need to emphasize how unlikely it is for someone to incur the amount of cost it takes to get that to happen. What would likely happen is that they would be brought up, they would be restored to a level that for static display, so they look the part. Getting a steam engine to actually run under power nowadays, given most of the infrastructure and, personnel required to, man them, don't exactly are hard to find. It's not like it can go to the steam engine factory or the works, nowadays, that those don't really exist. So, you need a lot of specialty workers. It's an expensive thing to do. So you have to have someone really dedicated to the trains, and usually it winds up being, whether accepting donations from railfans or, funding them themselves. And in fact, the examples I was given were railfans who own specific models of trains and said, I want this train to run again, and they funded the project, which is great. Don't get me wrong, I love it when that happens. I love seeing these old trains restored and brought back into the light and be able to actually, do what they were designed for so people can not just see them visually, but also see them run and see them do what they were made to do, bringing history to life here. I adore that, but I also don't like to get people's hopes up and say, I fully expect them to restore them to a running state. No, I don't. I would never expect that, because the other issue with a lot of these trains that I'm talking about is that while they do look intact, we don't know what their internals are like. And that's the biggest issue I have with these two planet classes, because they're under the water, and the pressure change isn't going to be that big of a deal, but you guys need to realize that there's a lot of stuff that goes into the creation of trains that wouldn't necessarily be considered safe by modern standards, particularly asbestos. It goes into the boilers. They use them in the actual construction. It's not just iron. There's a lot of, gunk and stuff in there. So you have to keep in mind that there's a lot of regulations and environmental hazards and things they have to consider before they even bring them up at all. And then when they do, they have to examine them and really see how much work it would take to get them to move. How many parts need to be replaced. Are you just going to build a whole new train anyway? That's kind of where you have to remember and be analytical about it. And remember that, we can't just, magically, wave a wand and have these things be back to the way they were, because, Mother Nature is, kind of mean, and, has taken a toll on stuff that just sits where it's not supposed to be. All that said, all that understood, I would love to see these two little guys restored at the bare minimum to static display. Like I said, they are discussing actually bringing them up. I would like to see them, brought up and restored to a level of static display, but I would also absolutely be over the moon if they were able to make them run again. We'll see what happens. Either way, they haven't even been brought up yet. We don't know what state they're in. Let's all be skeptical and remember that, we have to, be real, but they're there in the middle of the ocean, and they might not be there forever. Hopefully because we brought them up and not because they disintegrated, because that would be a tremendous loss for rail fans everywhere. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.